It's because it's true. There's like this resistance. Oftentimes when I see resistance and sort of like people describe it as being stuck almost in
Mhm.
my clients, that to me is a sign that it's grief work that's needed. We often look ahead when we feel stuck and see like,
Mhm.
can I push through to the next thing, whatever that is? Can I set a goal? Can I do better, harder? Actually, oftentimes we need to look back and give ourselves permission to feel the feelings we're having.
You've probably heard the saying that perimenopause is reverse puberty or puberty in reverse. There's some truth to that for sure, because we are seeing similar swings in hormones, hormones coming, hormones going. And anybody who might find themselves, as I do, in the transition through menopause, although I'm postmenopausal now, and living with people who are going through puberty knows that it feels like a cruel joke that Mother Nature has played on us, because we're going through these changes and they're going through these changes, and it doesn't always feel comfortable. But there are a lot of things in common about this transition, which is why I've invited my friend and coach and doula, Jessie Harrold, onto the podcast to talk about what these transitions have in common. And there actually is more in common than we think. They're uncomfortable, they're hormonal related, but what we're really missing isn't necessarily more information. It's we're missing the language to be able to describe this transition, this transformation, and also just to feel like we're a little bit less lost. This is something that happens to everyone. We go through puberty, we go through menopause, and if it's happening to you at the same time, or maybe you find yourself having young children and going through menopause early or on time, there's lots of overlap in our generation at this time that I don't think other generations have had to experience in the same way. Jessie is a beautiful writer. She's the author of 2 books, including Mothershift, which recently came out. And the way she describes things just brings comfort and just makes sense. So make a cup of tea and cozy up, because you'll definitely want to take in everything that Jessie has to say. And what I would love to hear actually is, if you are someone who is in that parallel transition with a child in your life, maybe it's a niece or just kind of people in your life who might be going through puberty, I'd love to hear how that impacted you. My oldest is almost 17 and my younger 2 turned 15 in March, and I'm 3 years postmenopause, so I actually feel like I'm okay now. But a few years ago, it was definitely a rough ride. So I'd love to hear from others who might have similar experiences. Hi, Jessie. Welcome to the Midlife Feast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So, backstory, you and I have known each other for many, many years.
Yeah.
And for a long time, our work hasn't really overlapped, because you have been more firmly in the motherhood, parenthood kind of support experience as a doula and, as a writer and as a support coach. And I've been in this kind of midlife menopause world for the last decade or so. But I wanted to have you on the podcast because I have noticed, and I'm sure you have as well, and I hear from a lot of people about this overlap that is becoming more and more common, where motherhood and especially perimenopause are overlapping. And the overlap that I'm in right now, which is parenting teenagers and being in postmenopause and having that overlap of, this is not great planning on Mother Nature's part to have these tumultuous times overlap. But yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Me too.
So tell the audience a little bit about who you are and what you do
Yeah,
before we
sure.
dive in.
So I kind of started this path when I became a doula 17 years ago. So if people are listening and they're not sure what a doula is, it's someone who provides support for the perinatal time, prenatally, and then through the birthing process and postpartum. And then a few years into that work, I noticed that the mothers that I was working with were changing everything about their lives, that motherhood kind of set off this cascade of other shifts in their lives. And so they were coming to me, and I became then a coach, and I started working with mothers and others, all women, through what I call radical transformations in their lives and rites of passage. And so, though kind of the beginnings of my work, and still a deep specialty and a thread of interest for me is working with mothers, I've also kind of expanded this work to look at all of these transformations that we go through, because as you allude to, there are these really common threads between them all.
That's a great explanation. And I think what we're going to dive into is some of those transformations. But the first one that I'd like to talk about is this identity shift. And in the menopause, midlife world, perimenopause world, there's this collection of symptoms that we're calling not feeling like myself. It's actually a research term that's being studied because there's a group of symptoms that includes not recognizing who you see in the mirror, feeling uncomfortable in your body, not sleeping, mood changes. And what I hear over and over again, and I can relate to having felt this way myself, is I just want to go back to feeling familiar. I want to go back to the person that I know. But kind of like once, anybody who has become a parent in whatever way, once you have a child, once you become a parent, there's no going back to who you were before, because it changes us in ways that, there's no takesy backsies on it. And it's kind of the same, I at least feel, as we go through this transformation of perimenopause, that there's a lot of letting go that needs to happen, but a big part of it is this shift in identity. So I'd love to talk to you about that. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Totally. So when we go through transformations, whether it's through matrescence, which is the word for the transition to motherhood, or through perimenopause or anything else in our lives, it's not just sort of a change to the things that we do. Like we tend to, in these kind of contexts, think about the behaviors that are shifting, and I know that's like a big part of the work that you do, is like shifting some of the behaviors that we're engaging in. And, it might be a sort of, shift to behaviors that shift to the things we're thinking or feeling or saying or doing. But actually underneath all of that is this identity shift. It's this time in our lives when we're asking what I call the "who am I now that ... question. Who am I now that? And we can use this question in a lot of different contexts in our lives, and use an identity shift lens to think about so many things. So who am I now that I'm a mother? Who am I now that I'm in these perimenopause, menopause years? One thing you and I have talked extensively about my first book, which is called Project Body Love, My Quest to Love My Body and the Surprising Truth I Found Instead. And I talk in that book about the identity shift of who am I now that I'm no longer willing to diet? And so it's this deeper question that runs underneath the behaviors, the thinking, the feeling, the doing, and into the who am I now that? And any transformation in our lives asks us to step into a new identity, a new way of being in the world, and therefore asks us to let go of who we are no longer. And we kind of have a real narrative in our culture that is not an ideal thing. Like, you should not lose yourself, especially within the context of motherhood. Perhaps we say that losing yourself in motherhood is the worst thing that could possibly happen, that you should not change through that process. And yet, there's this tremendous potential, because what we don't remember, I think, is that we become someone new, and often someone more deeply powerful and empowered and more ourselves, actually, through these transformations in our lives. And, I think the missing piece here is an ability to work with the grief of letting go of our former selves. So we live in this culture that really, we don't know how to grieve well. We try to kind of like get through to the other side of it. And we relegate grief and those kind of feelings of ambivalence and loss to bereavement and death. Those are the only times that we sort of give ourselves permission to grieve. But if we think of this idea of letting go of a former self, you are grieving a loss. You're grieving the death of a former self. And I know that sounds really intense. I think it sounds intense mostly because we don't have the tools to work with our grief and to like confront it and be with those difficult emotions. And as soon as we do have access to those things, it becomes a lot more doable. And it's just this kind of season of our lives that we move through where we feel the grief of whatever that might be in our former lives. And we allow ourselves to move through that. We allow ourselves to move through a time of liminality, of like betwixt and between. I don't know who I am yet, and I haven't stepped into this new identity yet. And then on the other side of that, right, we have these beautiful potentials and powers that unlock. And again, this is a parallel process for mothers going through matrescence and for those of us who are going through perimenopause and menopause right now. It's, I call it transformation literacy, right? It's like, how can we become more skilled at traversing change? And these are some of the building blocks of that.
Oh my gosh, I love how you described that. That was beautiful. Like that was poetic, honestly. And I think what was kind of going through my mind as I was listening to you describe this, especially that the expectation. So we don't talk about what to expect in midlife and beyond. We don't talk about that it's normal and expected to go through these things. And that also the grieving is normal. And we can grieve something without feeling like it's a forever loss, and I described it to somebody. My dad passed away almost 20 years ago now. And in the year before he died, when he was really sick, and in the first couple of years after, I was very much in the space where I just couldn't imagine ever being able to talk about his death, think about his death, remember him, look at pictures without being filled with grief. I could not imagine it. But now 20 years later, I said to someone, you know what? I am so thankful when the anniversary of his death comes up because it is a reminder for me to think of him. I no longer grieve that date. It is now a welcome date. I don't look at it with sadness. It's like, oh, here's this one day of the year when I always think of him. I'm so grateful for this day. So we need to change every conversation around grief, but especially around, I think, what we're losing. Because, it's like you said, there's this transition in this liminal space. And on the other side, there could be something good. I like to say this perimenopause thing, it's going somewhere good, but you've got to hang in for the ride.
It's so true. I think, there's this term called ambiguous loss, and it was originally coined to describe, kind of what you're talking about as it was originally coined to describe the feeling that people had when it was, generally in the context of military families whose loved one had been lost in combat and missing in action. And those families didn't know if they were grieving a death or if they were hoping against hope that their loved one would return. And so it's a really complex experience. And I have kind of borrowed that term to talk about, it's very much kind of the condition of both matrescence and perimenopause is this question of, will this part of me return or not? And I think we, sometimes we don't know the answer to that. We don't know if, I don't know. whatever, a particular hobby that we enjoy or something pre-motherhood that motherhood makes impossible, will return on the other side. Or maybe some of the experiences of perimenopause that feel so unmooring and disorienting. Will I feel like my old self again? And I think that's a really tricky feeling. And, the same tools and resources apply when we're working with ambiguous loss as we do with regular kind of, the loss of something that we know that is not coming back. And I think what you speak to with your dad is so true, is that our griefs become right-sized over time. That's what they're meant to do. And so, it may feel really big for people listening right now, like maybe their body is sort of feeling or working in a different way than it used to. Maybe their brain is feeling or working in a different way than it used to. And maybe some of those shifts are forever. And there might be a part of you that kind of holds on to those memories of the way things used to be, and that becomes right-sized over time.
Oh, I love that. Right-sized. That's such a good word. Speaking of some of the physical changes, you've heard me, and probably lots of people have heard me talk about hormone soup, and that the hormone soup that we're swimming in before we go through parenthood or pregnancy, and before and after perimenopause and menopause, that soup changes. And your brain actually is going through a remodeling. And that's kind of what some of Dr. Lisa Mosconi's research talks about, is that our brain goes through a remodeling. So it is very likely possible that we do become a different version of ourselves. I like to think it's an upgraded version, because I'm a much happier person and nicer person to be around now that I am not having cycles. But there's this change is happening in ways that we're just starting to understand. And the same is true with pregnancy. There's about what's the research around, like, we carry part of our children's DNA in our brain. This intimate connection with these biological life processes, events, we don't really fully understand. And so the only language we have is to hold on what culture tells us is the best part of our life, which, is when you're 18, or when you could fit into your wedding dress, or your high school jeans, or when you were most physically attractive, whatever it is. But who defines that, right? Who gets to say that is the best version of me?
Yeah. One of the things that I have done in my work and research, both in motherhood and in transitions across the life course for women, is to map some of these transformations that we go through against what we know about adult development psychology. We maybe talk about childhood milestones, and is your kid hitting the milestones, right? Well, we as adults actually also have milestones. We continue to develop and mature as we go through our adult and elder years. And what I've noticed is that a lot of these shifts, matrescence, perimenopause, especially when they're well supported, and we can dive into that a little bit, but especially when they're well supported, they act as like rocket boosters for a deepening maturity. So some of the kind of hallmarks of mature adult development are things like interdependence, like that ability to kind of call on support and offer support to others, and kind of be community minded or village minded. And nothing, if not motherhood for sure, rockets us into like, oh my goodness, most of us are lacking the village and we desperately seek it, right? And so interdependence becomes this kind of initiatory firewalk that we have to go through, or we're not going to make it. Some of the other things are the ability to grapple with complexity and paradox. And I mean, my goodness, there's like no experience like becoming a mother or going through perimenopause to, again, kind of initiate us into this ability to grapple with complexity. And another one is, and I'm sure your listeners will really appreciate this, from an intuitive eating lens, is another one we start to in-source our knowing. So rather
Mm.
than kind of looking to the external world to, figure out who we should be and who we should please and what's good, we begin to in-source that knowing, and we become what a researcher, Harvard researcher Robert Keegan calls self-authoring. So we become
Mm.
the author of our own lives.
Sure.
And again, like all of these transformations, when well supported, like give us the rocket boost into these beautiful markers of maturity. And I really think of those things as being not just important for us individually and maybe things that can support us well during these changes in our lives, but I actually think this is what the world needs more of. And oh my goodness, you and I are talking at quite the time in in the kind of global political landscape. And my goodness, do we ever need more people who are interdependent minded, who can hold complexity and paradox, so this is what kind of part of what I'm talking about when I talk about the potential on the other side of these transformations, that we become the kind of people that the world needs us to be.
Again, beautiful, poetic, even. When I think of the emotional changes, so the anxiety, the meno rage, the irritability, the feeling like you're prickly all the time, a lot of the resistance or a lot of the discomfort is in the resistance to change. Or accepting that now with your lived experience, there probably are a lot of things that are rightly pissing you off and for damn good reason. And so much, the cultural programming that we receive about, being good girls and about being quiet and cooperative and helpful and what our roles are, we get to this place of midlife where we have no more fucks to give, and we give them out very selectively. And so when somebody is telling us, you should be doing this, you should be doing that, you should look a certain way, you should go to the gym at 6 a.m. every day of your life, you should only have certain kinds of foods or never have other foods, if it doesn't align with what we're feeling, if there is that disconnect between what we know to be true in our bodies and what the rest of the world thinks we should do, it's hella uncomfortable. But that change, that resistance is worse. Resisting what you know to be true on this journey is even harder. So I'd love, and you're nodding your head for anybody who's listening and not watching. And I'm sure you see the exact same thing when people are going through becoming a parent, becoming a mother. So how do you kind of reconnect those timelines? How do you help people to realign, or where can they start? Because you probably can't answer that in like this podcast, but like, where do people start that realignment?
Yeah, totally. Well, my book, Mothershift, is kind of, goes through sort of the process of how you can begin to kind of grapple with these changes, because it's true. There's like this resistance. Oftentimes when I see resistance and sort of like people describe it as being stuck almost in my clients, that to me is a sign that it's grief work that's needed. We often look ahead when we feel stuck and see like, can I push through to the next thing, whatever that is? Can I set a goal? Can I do better, harder, whatever this is? Actually, oftentimes we need to look back and give ourselves permission to feel the feelings we're having about what we're letting go of. But so I've created this kind of roadmap really for transformation that I use in both Mothershift and with all of my clients. And I liken it to, I love to hike. And so I liken it to trail markers. So I often will be hiking, and just when I think that I've gotten myself lost, which happens more than I'd like to admit, I'll look up and I'll see a trail marker, and it's just like the best feeling, like, oh, I'm not lost, I'm on the trail. And it's, and so there's this metaphor can be kind of pulled into this idea of the changes that we go through. I'm not lost, there's nothing wrong with me. And that's sort of something you alluded to earlier, that we tend to pathologize these processes, so many of women's processes actually of becoming mothers and going through perimenopause and menopause. And like, you know, we can kind of normalize and support these experiences. So the first step of this model that I've created, the 4 elements of radical transformation, uses the element of earth. And in earth, it's the simplest thing, Jen. It's just naming the change. It is literally getting our toes in the earth of what's true for you now. Because our lives as, you know, humans and women are ecosystems. When one thing changes, everything changes, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of, you know, you alluded to that when we kind of can't tolerate one thing. There's a, you know, kind of all the dominoes start to fall when we're noticing all of the areas in our lives that we've been performing or masking or you know, not being authentic. And so naming it, oh my goodness, I don't feel the same in my body. My body is like foreign territory these days.
Yeah.
My marriage feels like such and such, you know, I feel a certain way about my job. It's literally kind of inventorying these shifts, because otherwise it just feels like this super nebulous, oh my God, everything is changing, and it's really overwhelming. And so that's kind of step 1.
I love that. I love
yeah.
the visual of like grounding.
Yes.
Because it does, and especially when you're not sleeping, especially when your clothes don't fit, you're not sure what's happening, especially if you're in that, like, is this perimenopause or am I going crazy kind of stage? Just having something that you can like stand firmly on and say, okay, regardless of what the label is, this is where I am.
Yes.
It doesn't matter why. This is where I am. This is what I'm feeling. And I think that holds a lot of power. And I think that's a really good thing for people to hold on to.
Yeah, totally.
I had another thought and I'm trying to remember it. I should have written it down. Okay, let's just keep moving on. It'll come back to me at some point. But so the last thing that I wanted to touch on was that even through the discomfort, or the suck, as I sometimes call it, of these changes, it is an opportunity. And that's kind of a cringy word, but it's a chance for us to reconnect with ourselves today, the person, the body, who we are today, and go through the process of grieving, but maybe not holding on to trying to get back to who we were or who we thought we wanted to be. And I sometimes have a hard time convincing people, I guess is the right word, that it's worth it, because there's so much emotional investment in, oh, but back when I felt so, or it was easier, because we hold on, we like those rose-colored glasses get really strong when we start looking back to what we perceive to be a better version of ourselves. I'd love to hear how you kind of introduce this concept of like, if this is an opportunity for growth and reconnection and getting to know the new version of you.
Totally. So I'm going to kind of like bring us back to this 4 elements model. We have earth, we have water, which is the grief and the sort of like working through some of that we've talked about. Then there's air, which is this liminal space of like, okay, I'm no longer, you know, this age, or I'm no longer, you know, premenopause, or you know, I'm no longer not a mother, whatever you want to say, but I haven't kind of fully stepped into this new identity yet. And then we move into fire, which is this place where we get to explore who we are becoming. And it's very sexy. It's very like, you know, we want to skip to the fire part, because that like grief time and liminal time is so uncomfortable. But I think kind of what you're speaking to is this liminal space of like, you know, I've let go of all of these things. Gosh, I really wish that I could go back, because I can't see what's ahead of me. And you know, what I say in this time is that when nothing is sure, everything is possible. So you have this like kind of in many ways blank slate. And the liminal time, again, so uncomfortable, but it's filled with possibility and potential. And in fact, we know that our brain kind of shifts into this sort of a different mode of operating when we're in liminality, when we're kind of everything is up in the air, as it were. And if you kind of want a very concrete example of this, it's like when we're in the shower, and you know how you have your best ideas in the shower. Showers, long walks in the woods, those are micro-liminal spaces in our day-to-day lives. And we're often so creative and so like kind of paradoxically productive in these times that appear unproductive, right?
Yeah.
You know, we all know this to be true, even if we don't kind of heed that beautiful advice to just rest, go for a walk instead of keeping on. And so there's this really beautiful quality to this not knowing time. And what I encourage the clients that I work with to experiment with here is something that I call the art of the possible. So like, given this new set of givens, given this kind of new landscape of your life, what is possible? And this is a time where I really encourage my clients to kind of blue sky it. Like, do you want to open up a cupcake stand at the local farmer's market? Okay, write it down. Like, you know, make a list of all of the things that could happen here. And, you know, I'll say that it's more possible to access that kind of creativity and curiosity when our nervous systems are regulated, when we've done that grief work, when we're feeling like, you know, relatively okay with where we are. So if you have tools and resources to support you to do that so that you can access this kind of playful curiosity about what's next, it can be really fun. And then as we move into fire, I encourage people to start experimenting with that. So like, okay, you want to open up a cupcake stand at your local farmer's market? Brilliant. Go look for your favorite cupcake recipe. There's a tiny experiment you can do to kind of nudge your way into who you're becoming. And it's not a time to like set long-term goals, because this is a developmental process. So it means that who you are now is different than the person you will be in a year. So we don't set long-term goals, because by the time you reach that goal, it won't be relevant anymore. You will not be the same person. So we take these tiny incremental steps, and we use that beautiful intuition that we've developed to feel into, okay, I looked up my favorite cupcake recipe. How did that feel? Oh, that was good. I got really excited about that. Okay, what's the next step?
I love it.
You know, and or, you know, or we use that intuition to be like, yeah, you know what? That felt really crunchy. I did not know that is not the path. And what I think is that it really allows us to step into the most authentic version of ourselves. And I mean, I think that like authenticity and liberation are really like what's at hand here, what's possible here. So hopefully that gives people like some tangible ideas, but also like, wow, this could happen.
And so much of what you said is rooted in, you know, acceptance of like, this is what it is. We can't go back and change time. We can't go back and choose a different, you know, it's not like a choose your own adventure book where you can go back to the beginning and start again. Where you are is where you are. We don't have to know why. We don't have to overthink it, but we do have to be curious, and we have to be open-minded. And this theme of curiosity, people will recognize, especially people who've worked with me, like we need to get curious about, what do you like? What, you know, what foods do you like? How do you like to eat? When do you like to eat? And who do you like to eat with even? What's your favorite plate? How can you experience satisfaction and not just nutrition and nourishment? And for so many people who have maybe been on a lifetime journey of dieting, they have never considered, do I enjoy eating this? It's always, should I? Is this good for me? Is this, you know, okay? So I love that you have introduced lots of little food for thought moments into this conversation. I can't wait to go back and listen, because I'm going to write lots of them down too. Thank you so, so much, Jessie. So I have two questions for you. The first is, What do you think is the missing ingredient in midlife?
Whew. I know you told me you were going to ask me this, and now I feel like, okay, I think based on our conversation today, I would say that it's this transformation literacy, and maybe very specifically some grief literacy,
Yeah.
because honestly, the possibility that opens up when we're able to really get with, yeah, there's no turning back. Those times were great. And what's possible next? I think that's really powerful.
I love that. And I absolutely 100% agree. And my second question is, where can people find you? Because I'm sure that lots of people will want to learn from you after listening to this.
Yeah, totally. So my website is jessieharrold.com. I'm mostly on Instagram. That's kind of my social media spot, jessie.es.harrold. I also write a monthly newsletter called Imaginalia, which is kind of this, it's really fun. People love it. And it's this kind of support and resources and some field notes from my own life, just regarding and supporting transformation. And then if people are interested in Mothershift, this is Mothershift, and it's available wherever books are sold. I know so many of my clients are going through perimenopause and matrescence at the same time.
Yeah.
And that is just like a whole thing. Oh my heavens. And hopefully this book can really support you through that.
Amazing. Thank you so, so much for joining me today, Jessie.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure.
And if you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please consider leaving a review or subscribing, because it helps other women just like you find us and feel supported in midlife.